The morning I woke up next to my husband's cold body, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. I was wrong. Because 3 weeks later, my own son would call me useless and throw me away like yesterday's garbage. But what he didn't know was that his father had left behind something that would change everything. And I mean everything. My name is Margaret Lewis, and at 71 years old, I learned that grief can make monsters out of the people you love most. This is my story. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I reached across our king-sized bed, the same bed Richard and I had shared for 47 years of marriage. My fingers found nothing but cold sheets. "Richard," I whispered, my voice still thick with sleep. When I turned to look at him, his face was peaceful, almost smiling. But his chest wasn't moving. His hand, the one that had held mine through childbirth, through Danny's first steps, through every storm life threw at us, it was ice cold. Have you ever screamed so loud that your throat bleeds? Have you ever felt your heart literally break inside your chest? That's what losing your soulmate feels like. That's what 50 years of love ending in a single heartbeat does to you. The paramedics said it was peaceful. A heart attack in his sleep. No pain, they promised. But I felt enough pain for both of us. What I didn't know then was that Richard had been preparing for this moment. And he'd left me something that would either destroy our family or save it. The funeral was everything Richard would have hated. Too fancy, too expensive, too much show. But our son Daniel insisted on the best of everything. "Dad deserves a proper send-off, Mom," he said, straightening his $1,000 tie. "People need to see we're doing right by him." People. Always people with Daniel. Never family. Never love. Just people and their opinions. My daughter-in-law Elaine stood beside him in her designer black dress, her red lips pursed as she surveyed the flower arrangements like a general inspecting troops. She'd never liked me, not from the day Daniel brought her home 15 years ago. Too common, I suppose. Too ordinary for her ambitious husband. I sat in that front pew, drowning in my grief, while behind me I could hear the whispers starting. "Poor Margaret," they said. "What will she do now? That house is too big for her alone. At her age, living by herself, it's dangerous." But the whisper that cut deepest came from my own daughter-in-law. I heard her behind me, talking to her sister. "She's completely helpless without Richard. Can barely work the TV remote, let alone manage a household. We're going to have to do something." Something. Like I was a problem to be solved instead of a woman mourning the love of her life. I should have paid more attention to those whispers. Because Elaine wasn't just gossiping. She was planning. They came on a Thursday evening, exactly 3 weeks after I'd buried my husband. I was in the kitchen, staring at a can of soup I couldn't bring myself to open, when the doorbell rang. Daniel stood on my front porch in his business suit, Elaine beside him with that smile she wore when she wanted something. The fake one that never reached her eyes. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said, not quite meeting my gaze. "We thought we'd stop by. See how you're doing." How was I doing? I was wearing the same pajamas for the 3rd day in a row. I hadn't washed my hair in a week. I'd been eating crackers for dinner because cooking for one felt like giving up completely. But I let them in because they were family. Because despite everything, Daniel was still my little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. We sat in the living room Richard and I had decorated together 40 years ago. The same blue sofa where we'd read bedtime stories to Daniel. The same coffee table where we'd played countless games of Scrabble. Every corner held a memory, and now every memory felt like a knife. "The house looks..." Elaine paused, her eyes scanning the family photos, the mismatched furniture, the lived-in comfort of a real home. Tired. Don't you think it looks tired, Daniel? My son nodded, but he was looking at me, not the house. You look tired too, Mom. When's the last time you went to the doctor? I wanted to tell him I was tired because I lay awake every night reaching for a man who wasn't there. I was tired because I'd forgotten how to be Margaret without being Richard's Margaret. Instead, I said, I'm fine. Just adjusting. Elaine leaned forward, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a caring tone. Margaret, honey, we've been talking. And we're worried about you. Really worried. The way she said worried made my blood run cold. This wasn't a social visit. This was an intervention. Mom, Daniel said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used with difficult clients. You can't go on like this. Like what? I asked, though I already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Elaine pulled out a tablet, swiping through what looked like research. You haven't been taking care of yourself. The house is falling apart. Mrs. Henderson next door called us. She's concerned about you wandering around the yard at night in your nightgown. Heat flooded my cheeks. I wasn't wandering. I was checking Richard's rose bushes. He always said. He's gone, Mom. Daniel's words hit like a slap. Dad is gone, and you're living in the past. You're. He stopped, looking at Elaine like he needed permission to continue. Just say it, Daniel, she urged. My son, my only child, the boy I carried for 9 months, the baby I nursed through colic, the teenager I waited up for every Friday night, looked me in the eye and said the word that would haunt me forever. You're useless, Mom. Completely useless without Dad. The room went dead quiet. Even Elaine looked surprised at how brutal he'd been. Useless. 51 years of marriage. 20 years of raising him alone while Richard worked overtime. Decades of birthday parties, scraped knees, high school heartbreaks, college tuition we could barely afford. And it all boiled down to one word. Useless. I didn't cry. Not then. I just nodded slowly and asked, what do you want me to do about it? Because what else do you say when your own child reduces you to nothing? When the person you love most in the world decides you're worth less than the furniture? That's when Elaine smiled that terrible smile again and reached into her purse. The brochure was glossy and expensive-looking, with pictures of smiling elderly people playing cards and tending small gardens. Green Hill Manor, it read in elegant script. Where golden years shine brightest. It's a beautiful facility, Margaret, Elaine said, spreading the pages across my coffee table like she was selling me a vacation package. Look at these amenities. 3 meals a day, housekeeping, medical care on site. You'd never have to worry about anything again. Never have to worry. Translation: never have to think, never have to choose, never have to be anything more than a body in a bed waiting to die. You've already looked into this, I said. It wasn't a question. Daniel had the grace to look embarrassed. We made some calls. Just to see what options were available. There's actually a room opening up next month. How much? I asked. What? Elaine blinked. How much does it cost? Well, we'd handle the finances, of course. The house would need to be sold to cover. There it was. The real reason for their concern. The house. The house Richard and I had bought as newlyweds, where we'd raised our son, where we'd planned to grow old together. They wanted to sell our home to warehouse me. And what if I say no? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The grief, the shock. You're not capable of making decisions like this right now. Not capable. Another way of saying useless. We're your family, Elaine added, her voice syrupy with false concern. We only want what's best for you. And honestly, Margaret, what's the alternative? Living here alone, talking to pictures of Richard, letting yourself fall apart. She wasn't wrong about the talking to pictures part. I did that. Every morning with my coffee, every evening before bed. But what she didn't understand was that those conversations were all I had left of a 50-year love story. Just visit, Daniel pleaded. One visit. If you hate it, we'll figure something else out. But I could see it in their eyes. There was no something else. There was only Greenhill Manor and the sale of my home and the monthly checks that would probably go straight to their bank account. What I should have done was throw them out. What I should have done was fight. Instead, I heard myself saying, when? The moving truck came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after Richard's funeral. I stood in my kitchen, our kitchen, watching strangers box up 47 years of marriage. Daniel supervised from the driveway, checking items off a list. The china goes to storage, he called out. Most of the furniture too. She won't need much where she's going. Where she's going. Like I wasn't standing right there. Like I was already gone. They let me keep one small box of photographs, Richard's wedding ring, and 3 changes of clothes. Everything else, our books, his tools, my garden gloves, the quilt his mother made us, disappeared into the truck like our life had never mattered. Mrs. Henderson from next door came over, tears in her eyes. Margaret, honey, are you sure about this? Before I could answer, Elaine appeared beside us. It's for the best, Mrs. Henderson. She'll be much safer with professional care. Professional care. Another way of saying I was broken. When the truck pulled away, I walked through my empty house one final time. The walls held lighter squares where our family photos had hung. The floors showed indentations from furniture that had sat in the same spots for decades. In our bedroom, I stood where Richard's side of the bed used to be. Where I'd found him that morning 6 weeks ago. Where our story had ended. Mom. Daniel appeared in the doorway. For just a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to have nightmares. You ready? Ready to leave the only home I'd ever really known? Ready to be shuffled off to die among strangers? Ready to become the useless old woman my son thought I already was? Yes, I lied. The drive to Greenhill Manor took 23 minutes. I counted every one of them, watching my neighborhood disappear in the rearview mirror. Daniel made small talk about the weather, about the facility's activities program, about how I'd make new friends. But all I could think about was Richard's voice the night before he died, whispering in the dark, I've taken care of everything, Maggie. No matter what happens, you'll be all right. Greenhill Manor looked exactly like the brochure. Clean, cheerful, and completely soul-crushing. My room was small but adequate, with a narrow bed, a single chair, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. See, Mom. Daniel said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. This'll be good for you. A fresh start. He hugged me awkwardly and promised to visit soon. We both knew he was lying. As his car disappeared down the drive, I sat on my narrow bed and let myself cry for the first time since the funeral. Not just for Richard, but for the son I'd lost too. For the family that had crumbled the moment we needed each other most. But as I unpacked my small box of belongings, my fingers found something I'd forgotten was there. A business card, tucked between 2 photographs. Caldwell and Associates, Estate Planning. Richard's lawyer. What I didn't know then was that my husband had been planning for this day long before he died. And he'd left me something that would either destroy what was left of our family, or give me back everything I'd lost. If you're still with me, if you recognize that feeling of being thrown away by the people who should love you most, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next, what Richard left behind in his will, it changes everything. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive a child who called you useless? Or are some words too cruel to take back? I'm reading every single response. Greenhill Manor wasn't what I expected. Walking through those glass doors, I felt like I was entering a 5-star hotel, not a place where people go to die. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. Well-dressed staff members glided between residents like they were serving afternoon tea at the Ritz. Mrs. Lewis, a woman in a crisp white uniform, approached with a smile so bright it could power the building. I'm Sandra, your wellness coordinator. Welcome to your new home. Home. The word felt like sandpaper on my tongue. She led me past the dining room, white tablecloths, fresh flowers, residents eating with actual silverware instead of plastic spoons. Past the library with its leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling books. Past the salon where women my age were getting their hair done, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. As you can see, we believe in maintaining dignity and elegance, Sandra chirped, her heels clicking on the polished floors. Our residents don't just live here, they thrive here. But I noticed what she didn't show me. The locked doors. The call buttons in every room. The way some residents stared at nothing, lost in their own minds. This wasn't a home. It was a beautiful prison where families stored their inconvenient elderly relatives. And now I was one of them. One of the discarded. One of the useless. But you know what the worst part was? Part of me was relieved. Part of me was grateful that I didn't have to pretend to be strong anymore. That relief lasted exactly 12 hours. I woke up the next morning to a gentle knock on my door. A young aide named Maria brought me breakfast on a silver tray, fresh fruit, perfectly scrambled eggs, coffee in a real ceramic cup. "Good morning, Mrs. Lewis," she said with genuine warmth. "How did you sleep?" Terribly. I'd spent the night listening to unfamiliar sounds. The hum of machines, footsteps in the hallway, an old man down the hall calling for his daughter who would never come. But I smiled and said, "Fine, thank you." The days at Greenhill followed a schedule as rigid as a military operation. Breakfast at 8. Morning activities at 10. Lunch at 12. Afternoon programs at 2. Dinner at 5. Lights out at 9. Everything was provided, everything was planned, everything was decided for me. They had a beauty salon where I could get my hair done twice a week. A library with thousands of books I had no desire to read. Art classes where we painted flowers that would end up in the trash. Bingo games with prizes no one really wanted. I watched the other residents shuffle through their days like ghosts. Mrs. Patterson, who spent hours staring out the window waiting for children who visited once a month. Mr. Rodriguez, who told the same story about his war service to anyone who would listen, because nobody remembered hearing it before. And slowly, I felt myself disappearing too. Becoming another well-fed, well-cared-for ghost in this elegant mausoleum. Daniel had promised to visit soon. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of checking the visitor log, of jumping every time the front desk phone rang, of making excuses to other residents about why my son was too busy to come. The luxury meant nothing when you had no one to share it with. The comfort felt hollow when it came from strangers paid to care. I was drowning in velvet and gold, until I met the two people who would remind me that I was still alive. Evelyn Martinez found me crying in the garden on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting on a marble bench, staring at roses that reminded me too much of Richard's garden, when a voice behind me said, "Honey, those tears are watering flowers that are already dead." I turned to see a tiny woman with silver hair and the sharpest eyes I'd ever encountered. She was maybe 80, but she moved like someone half her age. "I'm Evelyn," she said, settling beside me without invitation. "And you're the new widow in room 237. Margaret, right? Your son's the one who looks like he swallowed a lemon every time he visits." I almost smiled despite myself. He hasn't visited yet. Smart man. Guilt makes people do stupid things. Like spend money on fancy facilities instead of spending time with their mothers. That's how my friendship with Evelyn began. With brutal honesty wrapped in unexpected kindness. She introduced me to Harold Peterson that same evening at dinner. He was a retired English teacher with gentle hands and a voice like warm honey. While Evelyn had survived 3 husbands and raised 6 children, Harold had never married, dedicating his life to teaching Shakespeare to teenagers who thought Romeo and Juliet was a reality show. "We call ourselves the Breakfast Club," Evelyn announced, cutting into her chicken with surgical precision. "Harold provides the culture, I provide the commentary, and now you can provide the common sense." "What makes you think I have common sense?" I asked. Harold smiled. "Because you're still crying. The ones who stop crying are the ones we worry about." For the first time since Richard's death, I felt like myself again. Not the useless widow Daniel saw. Not the patient Sandra managed. Just Margaret, a woman with opinions and stories and 40 years of marriage wisdom to share. Evelyn had been at Greenhill for 2 years, ever since she'd broken her hip and her children decided she was too much responsibility. Harold had been there 3 years, placed by a nephew who inherited his house and wanted to sell it quickly. We were all refugees from families who found us inconvenient. But together, we created our own little family of the abandoned. "You know what the hardest part is?" I asked them one evening as we sat in the library after dinner. "Tell us," Harold said gently. "I keep thinking I failed somehow. Like if I'd been a better mother, a better wife, a better woman. Maybe my son wouldn't have thrown me away." Evelyn reached over and squeezed my hand. "Sweetheart, the only thing you failed at was raising a son who thinks love is optional." But what none of us knew then was that love, real love, sometimes works in ways we can't see. The days were bearable with Evelyn and Harold. But the nights were when grief came calling like an unwelcome visitor who wouldn't leave. I'd lie in my narrow bed, listening to the institutional sounds of Greenhill, the soft beeping of monitors, the whispered conversations of night staff, the occasional cry from someone lost in their dreams. "Richard," I'd whisper to the darkness, "what would you think of our son now?" In my mind, I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were lying beside me. "Give him time, Maggie. People do foolish things when they're scared." Scared of what? Of becoming us. Of growing old. Of needing help someday. I'd close my eyes and remember our mornings together. How Richard would bring me coffee in bed every Saturday for 47 years. How he'd read me the funny parts of the newspaper while I pretended to still be asleep. How he'd kiss my forehead and whisper, "Good morning, beautiful," even when I looked like I'd wrestled with a tornado. Now I woke up alone to institutional breakfast trays and cheerful aides who called me sweetie, because they couldn't remember my name. I kept our wedding photo on my nightstand, the only personal item Daniel had let me bring. Every night, I'd trace Richard's face with my finger and tell him about my day. I met a woman named Evelyn today. You'd like her. She reminds me of your sister Beth. Sharp tongue but a good heart. Some nights, the guilt was overwhelming. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe I was useless. Maybe I'd become a burden without realizing it. Maybe loving someone for 50 years had made me forget how to be alone. There were nights I wondered if it would be easier to just fade away. To become one of those residents who stopped talking, stopped trying, stopped hoping for anything better. But then I'd remember Richard's last words to me. Not the night he died, but the last conversation we'd had while he was truly present. "Promise me something, Maggie," he'd said, taking my hands in his. "Promise me you won't let anyone convince you that you don't matter. You matter to me. You've always mattered." Those words became my anchor in the dark nights. My reminder that even if my son had forgotten my worth, the love of my life never had. What I didn't know was that Richard had done more than just whisper promises in the dark. He'd made sure those promises would be kept. 3 months into my exile at Greenhill, I finally got a phone call from Daniel. Not a visit, a call. "Hi, Mom," his voice crackled through the room phone they'd installed on my nightstand. "How are you settling in?" Settling in. Like I was a piece of furniture he'd rearranged. "I'm fine," I lied, sitting on my narrow bed in my sterile room while he called from the house I'd helped him buy with my inheritance. "That's great. Elaine and I have been meaning to visit, but things have been crazy here. We're doing some renovations." Renovations. On the house I'd been forced to sell to pay for this place. "We're putting in a pool," he continued, excitement creeping into his voice. "And Elaine found this amazing contractor to redo the kitchen. You should see the marble countertops. They're exactly what she's always wanted." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him how he could be installing marble countertops with my money while I sat in a nursing home eating institutional food off plastic trays. Instead, I said, "That sounds lovely. The girls are doing great too. Sarah made honor roll again, and Emma got the lead in the school play. We're so proud. My granddaughters. The ones who barely looked up from their phones when I visited. The ones who hadn't called once since I'd been here. Tell them I said congratulations," I whispered. "I will. And Mom? We'll visit soon, okay? Maybe next month when things calm down." Next month. Always next month. When I hung up, Evelyn was standing in my doorway with 2 cups of tea and a knowing look. "How much of that did you hear?" I asked. "Enough to know your son's an idiot," she said, settling into my single chair. Marble countertops. We sat in silence, sipping our tea and watching through my window as families visited other residents. Grandchildren running through the gardens. Sons and daughters taking their parents out for lunch. "You know what I learned in my 82 years?" Evelyn said finally. "Some people love conditionally. They love you when you're useful, when you're strong, when you're convenient. And then there are people who love you because you exist. Because you breathe. Because you're you." "How do you tell the difference?" "Time," she said simply. "Time always tells the truth." As the weeks passed, I began to see the truth clearly. Daniel's love had conditions I'd never recognized. Be strong. Be useful. Don't be a burden. Don't need anything. Don't grow old or sick or sad. But Richard's love? That had been unconditional. Even in death, I could feel it surrounding me like armor. What I couldn't have imagined was that he'd found a way to make that love visible to everyone else too. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after I'd arrived at Greenhill. Sandra knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen before. Curiosity mixed with something that looked almost like respect. "Mrs. Lewis? There's a gentleman here to see you. A Mr. Caldwell." My heart stopped. Richard's lawyer. I found him in the family visiting room, a distinguished man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood when I entered, extending his hand with old-fashioned courtesy. "Mrs. Lewis, I'm Thomas Caldwell. I was your husband's attorney." "I know who you are," I said, settling into one of the overstuffed chairs. "But I don't understand why you're here. Richard's been gone 6 months. Isn't everything finished?" Mr. Caldwell smiled, and there was something almost mischievous in that smile. "Actually, Mrs. Lewis, I think it's just beginning." He opened his leather briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope. "Your husband was a very thorough man. Very strategic. He came to me 2 years ago with some specific instructions." "What kind of instructions?" "The kind that required patience. And perfect timing." He leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Lewis, has your son mentioned anything to you about your husband's will?" I blinked. "Richard's will? No, Daniel handled all of that. He said there wasn't much. Just the house and some savings. Everything went to pay for my care here." Mr. Caldwell's eyebrows rose. "I see. And you believed that?" Something cold settled in my stomach. "Are you telling me that's not true?" "I'm telling you that your husband left very specific instructions about when and how his will should be executed. And that time has come." He handed me a business card along with a formal letter. "I need you to come to my office, Mrs. Lewis. This Friday at 2 o'clock. And I need your son to be there as well." My hands were shaking as I read the letter. Official language about the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Lewis, and all interested parties must be present. "Mr. Caldwell," I whispered, "what aren't you telling me?" He stood, closing his briefcase with a decisive snap. "I'm telling you that your husband loved you very much. And that love, well, let's just say it's about to become very clear to everyone involved." After he left, I sat alone in that visiting room for an hour, staring at the letter in my hands. Richard had been planning something. For 2 years, he'd been planning something. That evening, I called Daniel from the phone in my room. For once, he answered on the first ring. "Mom? Is everything okay? You never call." "I need you to come with me somewhere on Friday," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Mom, I'm really busy this week. The renovations are in full swing, and..." "Daniel." Something in my tone must have gotten through to him. "Richard's lawyer wants to see us. Both of us. It's about the will." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Daniel. I'll pick you up at 1:30, he said finally. As I hung up, Evelyn appeared in my doorway with that knowing look she got when she sensed drama brewing. "Well?" she asked. I said slowly, "I'm about to find out what kind of love Richard really left me." What I didn't know was that in 3 days, everything would change. The son who called me useless was about to learn exactly how much his father had valued the woman he'd thrown away. Have you ever had someone underestimate you completely? Someone who thought they knew your worth better than you did? Tell me in the comments, because what happens next will make you believe in justice again. Friday morning came like a storm I could feel in my bones. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning in my narrow bed, wondering what Richard could have possibly left unsaid after 50 years of marriage. Evelyn knocked on my door at 7:30, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of expression mothers get when they're about to send their children off to war. "You look terrible," she announced, settling into my single chair. "Good. That means you're taking this seriously." "I don't even know what this is," I admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Richard never mentioned another will. He never mentioned anything." "Honey," Evelyn said, her voice gentler than usual, "in my experience, the best surprises come from the people who love us most. And the worst ones come from the people who think they know us least." I stared out my window at the parking lot where Daniel would pick me up in 6 hours. Part of me wanted to call and cancel, to pretend Mr. Caldwell had never existed, to accept the life my son had chosen for me. But a bigger part, the part that had been Richard's wife for 50 years, wanted answers. I spent the morning getting ready like I was preparing for battle. The blue dress Richard had always loved. The pearl earrings he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. The wedding ring I'd never stopped wearing, even though the matching band lay buried with him. Harold appeared just before lunch, looking unusually formal in a pressed shirt and tie. "I wanted to give you this," he said, pressing a small piece of paper into my hand. "It's a quote from Hamlet. Act 3, Scene 4. I unfolded the paper. "This above all, to thine own self be true." "Whatever happens today," Harold said quietly, "remember who you are. Not who they've told you to be. Who you really are." At exactly 1:30, I stood in the lobby of Greenhill Manor, clutching my purse and trying to calm my racing heart. Through the glass doors, I could see Daniel's BMW pulling into the circular drive. He walked in wearing his most expensive suit, the one he wore to court when he needed to intimidate opposing counsel. But something was different about his face, a tightness around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Hi, Mom," he said, and for just a moment, he sounded like the little boy who used to run to me when he was scared. "You look nice," he added, and I realized he was nervous too. As we walked to his car, I wondered if he was thinking the same thing I was, that in 1 hour, everything we thought we knew about our family was about to change forever. What I didn't know was that Daniel had been preparing for this moment too. And his preparations were about to backfire spectacularly. The silence in Daniel's BMW was thick enough to cut with a knife. He gripped the steering wheel like it might escape, his knuckles white against the leather. "So," he said finally, his voice carefully casual, "do you have any idea what this is about?" I studied his profile, the strong jaw he'd inherited from Richard, the worry lines that were new since the funeral. "You tell me. You handled all of Richard's affairs." "I handled the estate settlement. The house, the bank accounts, Dad's pension. Everything was straightforward." He glanced at me quickly. "There wasn't much left after expenses." Expenses. Another way of saying after they'd taken my home and my independence. "Then why does Mr. Caldwell want to see us?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Probably just some paperwork. Loose ends. You know how lawyers are, they have to justify their fees somehow." But I caught him checking his phone at a red light, and I saw the name on the screen, Elaine, 6 missed calls. "She's worried about you," I said. "What?" "Elaine. She's been calling all morning." Daniel's face flushed. We've been discussing some financial planning, investment opportunities. Now that we have more resources." Resources. My house. My life savings. The money Richard had worked 60 years to accumulate. What kind of investments? Nothing major. Just diversifying. building something for the girls' college funds. But his hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel, and I remembered something Richard used to say, a man who's hiding something can't sit still. As we pulled into the parking lot of Caldwell and Associates, Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time he answered it. "What do you want, Elaine?" His voice was sharp with stress. "I'm here with Mom." "No, I don't know what this is about." "Yes, I handled everything properly." He hung up and sat for a moment, staring at the brick building in front of us. "Daniel," I said quietly, "is there something you haven't told me?" For just a second, his mask slipped, and I saw fear in his eyes. Raw, desperate fear. "Mom, whatever happens in there, whatever Dad might have written, you have to understand I was trying to do what was best for everyone. The nursing home, selling the house, it was practical. It was necessary." That's when I understood. Daniel wasn't nervous about what Richard might have left me. He was terrified about what Richard might have left him. "Let's go find out," I said, opening my car door with more confidence than I'd felt in months. As we walked toward the building, I could feel something shifting inside me. The powerless widow was dissolving, replaced by someone I hadn't been in a very long time, Richard's partner. The woman he'd trusted with 50 years of his secrets. And if Richard had one more secret to share, I was ready to hear it. Caldwell and Associates occupied the entire third floor of a downtown building that had survived 3 generations of St. Louis business. The elevator opened onto a reception area that whispered old money and older secrets. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs worn soft by decades of anxious clients, and the kind of silence that comes with serious conversations. "Mr. Caldwell is expecting you," the receptionist said, her voice pitched to match the solemnity of the surroundings. She led us down a hallway lined with portraits of distinguished men in expensive suits, the kind of lawyers who handled fortunes, not traffic tickets. I could hear Daniel's breathing beside me, shallow and quick. His expensive suit suddenly looked like armor that wasn't quite fitting right. Thomas Caldwell's office was exactly what I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes, a massive mahogany desk that probably cost more than most people's cars, and windows that looked out over the city Richard and I had called home for 50 years. But it was Caldwell himself who surprised me. Instead of the stern, intimidating figure I'd braced myself for, he rose from behind his desk with the gentle manner of a family doctor about to deliver news that would change everything. "Mrs. Lewis, Daniel," he said, gesturing to 2 chairs positioned precisely in front of his desk. "Please sit." The chairs were positioned so that Daniel and I faced each other slightly, an arrangement that seemed accidental but felt deliberate. On the desk between Caldwell and us lay a single manila folder, thick with documents and sealed with a red ribbon that looked both formal and final. "Before we begin," Caldwell said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to do, "I want you both to know that your husband and father was one of the most thoughtful clients I've ever had the privilege to serve." Daniel shifted in his chair. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm not sure why we're here. I handled Dad's estate 6 months ago. Everything was settled." Caldwell's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry, Daniel, but I'm afraid that's not accurate. The estate was never settled because the will was never read." The color drained from Daniel's face. "What do you mean?" "I took care of everything. The house, the accounts. You took care of settling debts and expenses using liquid assets your father had specifically designated for that purpose," Caldwell said calmly. "But his actual estate, his will, has been waiting for the right time to be executed." I felt something stirring in my chest, not hope exactly but recognition. This was exactly the kind of thing Richard would do. Patient, methodical, strategic. Caldwell opened the folder with the reverence of a priest handling scripture. "The last will and testament of Richard James Lewis, dated March 15, 2 years ago." 2 years ago. Richard had written this will 2 years before he died, which meant he'd been planning this moment for a very long time. The office fell completely silent except for the soft tick of an antique clock on the mantelpiece and the almost inaudible rustle of papers as Caldwell prepared to read words that would either destroy our family or save it. I gripped the arms of my chair and tried to prepare myself for whatever Richard had left behind. But as I looked across at my son, my only child, the boy I'd raised and loved and lost, I realized that no amount of preparation would be enough for what was coming. Caldwell cleared his throat, looked directly at me, and said the words that would change everything. I, Richard James Lewis, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament. And with those words, the life my son had built on the ashes of mine was about to crumble. I, Richard James Lewis, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. Caldwell's voice filled the silent office like a judge pronouncing sentence. To my beloved wife, Margaret Elizabeth Lewis, who has been my partner, my strength, and my heart for 50 years, I leave everything. The words hit the room like a physical force. Daniel's sharp intake of breath was the only sound, followed by a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Everything. The house at 1247 Maple Street, purchased in our first year of marriage, Caldwell continued, his voice steady and clear, all bank accounts, savings, investments, pension funds, and any other assets I may possess at the time of my death. I watched my son's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like panic. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. "That can't be right. I've been managing Mom's finances. The house was sold to pay for her care. The accounts were liquidated." Caldwell looked at him with what might have been pity. "Daniel, I'm afraid you've been managing accounts your father set up specifically for estate settlement and your mother's immediate needs. The bulk of his assets were held in trust, waiting for this reading." "How much?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Caldwell consulted a separate document, including the house, investments, life insurance, and accumulated interest over the past 6 months. Approximately $2.7 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. $2.7 million. Richard, my careful accountant husband who clipped coupons and drove the same car for 15 years, had somehow accumulated a fortune. "But the house," Daniel stammered. "We sold the house. For $800,000. Where did that money go?" "Into an account designated for your mother's care," Caldwell replied. "She's been paying for Greenhill Manor out of her own funds all along." I almost laughed. While I'd been living in that sterile room, eating institutional food, and watching Daniel enjoy his marble countertops, I'd been paying for my own imprisonment with money that was already mine. "Richard knew," I said quietly, the pieces finally clicking together. "He knew what would happen." Caldwell nodded. "Your husband was very specific about his concerns. He wanted to ensure that your care was never dependent on anyone else's generosity or convenience." "But there's more," Caldwell said, turning the page. "Your husband left specific instructions about how this inheritance should be handled." Daniel leaned forward desperately. "Instructions?" "Yes," Caldwell said, his eyes moving to Daniel with something that might have been disappointment. "Instructions that depend entirely on how his son chose to treat his mother in her time of greatest need." I felt my breath catch. This wasn't just about money. This was about judgment. This was about Richard, even in death, teaching our son the lesson that life had apparently failed to teach him. "Which brings us," Caldwell said, turning to a new section of the will, to the provisions regarding Daniel Lewis. My son went completely still, like a deer sensing a predator. And in that moment, I realized that everything, the nursing home, the cruelty, the word useless, had all been leading to this. Richard's final lesson was about to begin. Caldwell's voice took on a different quality as he began to read the section that would change Daniel's life forever. To my son Daniel, I leave the following: the knowledge that a man's true worth is measured not by what he accumulates, but by how he treats those who cannot help him in return. Daniel's face went white. What does that mean? What about my inheritance? If, upon my death, Daniel has shown respect, kindness, and care for his mother in her time of grief, if he has honored the woman who sacrificed her own dreams to raise him, then half of my estate shall pass to him upon Margaret's death. There was hope in Daniel's eyes for exactly 3 seconds. However, Caldwell continued, and his voice carried the weight of absolute judgment, if Daniel has chosen to abandon his mother, to treat her as a burden rather than a blessing, to prioritize his own comfort over her dignity, then he shall receive nothing but this reminder: respect for one's parents is not optional, and love that comes with conditions is not love at all. The office fell so quiet I could hear the traffic from the street 3 floors below. Daniel sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, as the full impact of his father's words settled over him. Based on the evidence presented to me, Caldwell said, consulting another document, including witness statements from Greenhill Manor staff, financial records showing the source of Mrs. Lewis's care payments, and testimony regarding the circumstances of Mrs. Lewis's placement in residential care. Daniel looked like he might be sick. It is my determination that the conditions for inheritance have not been met. Therefore, Daniel Lewis is entitled to nothing from his father's estate. Daniel erupted from his chair like he'd been shot. This is insane. You can't do this. I'm his son. I have rights. You have the right to contest the will in court, Caldwell said calmly. Though I should mention that your father anticipated that possibility and left detailed documentation of his reasoning, including recordings of conversations he had with you about your mother's future. Recordings. Richard had recorded their conversations. My methodical, strategic husband had documented everything. She was useless. Daniel shouted, pointing at me with a finger that shook with rage. She couldn't take care of herself. She was falling apart. What was I supposed to do? Let her die alone in that house? And there it was. The word that had haunted me for 6 months, thrown back into the room like a knife. Even now, even facing the loss of millions, Daniel couldn't see past his own cruel judgment. I stood slowly, feeling stronger than I had since the morning I'd found Richard's cold body. I wasn't useless, Daniel, I said quietly. I was grieving. I was lost. I was broken. But I wasn't useless. And you weren't supposed to fix me or manage me or warehouse me. You were supposed to love me. Daniel stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Mom, I was trying to help. I was trying to do what was best. You were trying to do what was easiest, I corrected. For you. Caldwell cleared his throat. There is one more provision, Mrs. Lewis. Your husband left you a letter, to be opened only after the will was read. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Richard's careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then you know the truth. You were never useless. You were never a burden. You were the best thing that ever happened to our family, and I couldn't bear the thought of you doubting that even for a moment. The money is yours to do with as you wish. But more than that, your life is yours to do with as you wish. Live it fully, love it completely, and never let anyone convince you that you don't matter. You matter to me. You've always mattered. Forever yours, Richard. Tears I'd been holding back for months finally came. But they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of recognition, of vindication, of a love so deep it could reach beyond death to protect me. Daniel was still standing there, looking lost and desperate and young. Mom, he whispered. What do I do now? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the successful lawyer who'd called me useless, but the frightened little boy who'd never learned that love isn't something you earn, it's something you give. Now, I said, folding Richard's letter carefully and putting it in my purse, you learn what your father was trying to teach you. Which is that some things are more valuable than money, and some words can't be taken back. But if you're very lucky, and if you're very sincere, love might be stronger than pride. What happened next will surprise you. Because this story isn't about money, it's about what happens when love sets boundaries. When someone who's been thrown away finds their power again. Subscribe if you believe in second chances. Or if you believe some people don't deserve them. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive Daniel? Or are some betrayals too deep to heal? Because my choice about my son's future was about to shock everyone, including myself. The silence in Caldwell's office lasted exactly 10 seconds after I asked Daniel what he would do now. Then he exploded like a pressure cooker that had been building steam for months. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his face turning red as he grabbed his briefcase from the floor. "Complete bullshit." He spun around to face Caldwell, his expensive suit wrinkled from gripping the chair arms. "You can't do this. There has to be a way to contest this. Undue influence, diminished capacity, something." "Your father was examined by 2 independent physicians when he updated his will," Caldwell said calmly. "I have their reports stating he was of completely sound mind. And as for undue influence..." He glanced meaningfully at me. "I think the record shows who was influencing whom." Daniel's eyes turned wild, cornered. "She manipulated him. She poisoned him against me. 50 years of marriage. She had plenty of time to turn him into her puppet." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Even now, even facing the consequences of his own cruelty, Daniel couldn't accept responsibility. It was easier to blame me than to look at what he'd become. "Daniel," I said quietly, "stop." But he was beyond hearing. "You want to know the truth?" he snarled, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "You were pathetic after Dad died. Completely pathetic. Crying all the time, wandering around in your nightgown, talking to his picture like he could hear you. We saved you from yourself. We gave you a beautiful place to live, with people to take care of you, and this is how you repay us? By stealing our inheritance. Our inheritance. Not Dad's money, not the estate he and Mom built together. Ours." Like he'd been counting it as his own from the moment Richard drew his last breath. "This isn't over," Daniel said, grabbing his coat and heading for the door. "I'll fight this. I'll take it to court. I'll prove he wasn't thinking clearly." The sound of the door slamming behind him echoed through the office like a gunshot. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat and the soft tick of Caldwell's antique clock. "I'm sorry you had to see that," I said to Caldwell, suddenly embarrassed by my son's behavior. "Mrs. Lewis," he said kindly, "I've been practicing law for 47 years. I've seen grief do terrible things to people. But I've also seen it reveal who they really are. And that's what hurt the most. This wasn't grief talking. This was Daniel, the real Daniel, finally exposed. What I didn't know was that his humiliation was just beginning. I can only imagine the car ride home, but knowing Elaine, I'm sure it was spectacular. Daniel told me later, during one of our painful attempts at reconciliation, that she didn't say a single word for the first 10 minutes. She sat in the passenger seat of his BMW, staring out the window with the kind of stillness that comes before hurricanes. Daniel kept glancing at her, waiting for the explosion he knew was coming. It came as they pulled into the driveway of the house they'd bought with my money. $2.7 million, she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "Elaine. $2.7 million, Daniel. That your mother, your pathetic, useless mother, now controls. They sat in the car, engine running, staring at the marble fountain Elaine had installed in the front yard last month. The fountain that had cost more than most people made in a year. "How?" she demanded, turning to face him with eyes like ice chips. "How did you not know about this? You're a lawyer, for Christ's sake." Dad never mentioned another will. He handled all his own finances. "I thought. You thought wrong." Her voice could have cut glass. "Do you understand what this means? Do you have any idea what we've lost?" This wasn't grief or disappointment. This was pure, calculating fury. Elaine had been counting Richard's money as hers from the day she married Daniel, and now she was watching millions slip through her manicured fingers. "I told you we should have handled this differently," she hissed. "I told you putting her in that place was too obvious, too cruel. But no, you had to be dramatic. You had to call her useless to her face." And there it was. Even Elaine had known it was cruel. But she'd gone along with it anyway because she thought it would be profitable. "I can't look at you right now," she said, getting out of the car and slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Daniel sat alone in his driveway, looking at the house he'd furnished with my money, and for the first time in months, he was completely alone with the consequences of his choices. What he didn't know was that Elaine was already on her phone, calling her sister, her mother, her book club friends. Within hours, everyone in their social circle would know that Daniel Lewis had lost his inheritance because he'd mistreated his mother. In their world of country clubs and charity galas, there was no faster way to become a pariah than to be known as someone who abandoned their elderly parent for money. The story would spread like wildfire, growing more dramatic with each telling, until Daniel became the cautionary tale that other wealthy families whispered about at dinner parties. And the most beautiful part? Elaine, in her fury and embarrassment, was about to become the instrument of his complete social destruction. The Westwood Country Club had been Daniel and Elaine's second home for 15 years. Every Friday evening, every charity auction, every important business connection had been made over 18 holes and expensive wine. But the Friday night after the will reading, something was different. Conversations stopped when Daniel walked into the dining room. Smiles became strained. Old friends suddenly remembered urgent phone calls. At the bar, Thomas Henderson, whose wife had called us about my wandering in the yard, was holding court with a group of men Daniel had considered friends. "Can you imagine?" Henderson was saying, his voice just loud enough for Daniel to hear. "Putting your own mother in a home so you could sell her house. And then to find out she was worth millions all along." The story had already grown in the telling. By now, according to country club gossip, Richard had left me $5 million. By next week, it would probably be 10 million. But it was the women who delivered the killing blow. Elaine had been president of the Ladies' Auxiliary for 3 years, organizing charity luncheons and fundraising galas with military precision. Patricia Whitmore, who had been Elaine's closest friend and co-chair of the hospital benefit, was now telling anyone who would listen about the time Elaine had laughed about putting difficult parents in facilities. She actually said, Patricia whispered to a circle of perfectly coiffed women, that nursing homes were invented to solve the problem of inconvenient elderly parents. Can you imagine saying that about your husband's mother? By Sunday, the invitations had stopped coming. The committee positions were quietly reassigned. The golf foursome that Daniel had played with every Saturday for a decade suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Even worse, the story had reached the private school where their daughters attended. Sarah and Emma Lewis, once popular because of their parents' social status, now faced whispers about their family's greed and cruelty. "Is it true your dad stole from Grandma?" one of Emma's friends asked during lunch. The question was innocent enough, but it cut deep because even at 16, Emma could see the truth in it. The girls began asking questions that Daniel and Elaine couldn't answer. Why hadn't they visited Grandma Margaret? Why had they sold her house? Why was everyone at school talking about their family like they were villains? Within 2 weeks, the Lewis family had gone from social prominence to social pariahs. The marble countertops and the swimming pool and all the expensive renovations suddenly felt like monuments to their shame. And in the quiet moments, when the house was too silent and the phone wasn't ringing, Daniel began to understand what I had felt in that narrow bed at Greenhill Manor. The difference was, I had been abandoned for money. He had been abandoned for character. The morning after the will reading, I woke up in my narrow bed at Greenhill Manor feeling like a different person. Not because of the money, though I'd be lying if I said that didn't matter, but because of what the money represented. Richard's final gift wasn't financial. It was the restoration of my dignity, the return of my voice, the proof that I had mattered to someone who mattered to me. For the first time in 6 months, I called the front desk and asked to speak to the administrator. Not to complain or ask for anything, but to inquire about making some changes to my living situation. "Of course, Mrs. Lewis," Sandra said, and I could hear the difference in her voice. Word had traveled fast through the facility. I wasn't just another abandoned elderly resident anymore. I was a woman of means. "I'd like to move to one of the larger apartments," I said. "The ones with the kitchenettes and the garden views." Within hours, I was looking at a beautiful suite with hardwood floors, a small kitchen, and French doors that opened onto a private patio. It cost 3 times what my small room cost, but that wasn't a problem anymore. That evening, Evelyn and Harold helped me move my few belongings to my new apartment. We celebrated with champagne that Evelyn had somehow procured from the kitchen staff. "To Richard," Harold said, raising his plastic cup with mock solemnity, "who proved that love is the longest game of all." But as we sat in my new living room, watching the sunset through my French doors, I realized that money was only part of what had changed. For 6 months, I had seen myself through Daniel's eyes, useless, broken, inconvenient. But Richard's will had given me back my own eyes, and through them, I could see the truth. I wasn't useless. I was experienced. I wasn't broken. I was grieving, which is what you do when you lose someone precious. I wasn't inconvenient. I was human, with needs and feelings and the right to be treated with dignity. "You know what I think?" I said to my friends as we watched the last light fade from the sky. "Tell us," Evelyn said. "I think Richard didn't leave me that money to make me rich. He left it to remind me that I'm not poor. Not in spirit, not in worth, not in the ways that really matter." Harold smiled. "And what about Daniel?" That was the question that kept me awake in my beautiful new apartment. What about Daniel? He was still my son, despite everything. Still the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The money gave me power I'd never had before. The power to punish or forgive. The power to teach the lesson Richard had started, or to show mercy he might not have approved of. But it also gave me something more dangerous than power: choice. And choosing what to do about my son would be harder than anything I'd faced, including Richard's death. For now, I waited. I lived in my beautiful apartment, had dinner with my friends, and waited for Daniel to decide what kind of man he really wanted to be. The phone number was the same. If he wanted to reach me, he knew how. The question was, would he? 3 weeks passed after the will reading before Daniel called. 3 weeks during which I settled into my new life, had dinner with Evelyn and Harold every evening, and tried not to jump every time the phone rang. I knew from Harold, whose nephew worked at Daniel's law firm, that things weren't going well. The story of the disinherited son had spread through legal circles like wildfire. Clients were quietly taking their business elsewhere. Partners were asking uncomfortable questions. Evelyn, who maintained an impressive network of gossip sources, reported that Elaine had been quietly removed from her charity positions and that their daughters were having a difficult time at school. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt heartbroken. All of me felt exhausted by the weight of holding my son's future in my hands. When the call finally came, it was on a Tuesday evening. I was reading in my new apartment, enjoying the silence and the freedom to turn pages without anyone checking on me, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I was tired of being disappointed, tired of hoping for something that might never come. But it was my son. And despite everything, he was still my son. "Hi, Mom." His voice was different. Smaller. The aggressive confidence of the successful lawyer was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like the boy I remembered. "Hello, Daniel." The silence stretched between us like a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. I've been thinking about what happened at the lawyer's office. Have you? Mom, I need you to know. I never meant for things to go the way they did. I was trying to help. I really thought the nursing home was the best thing for you. There was truth in his voice, but not the whole truth. He had thought it was best for him, best for his family, best for his bank account. And now? I asked. What do you think now? The pause lasted so long I thought he might have hung up. Now I think I made a terrible mistake, he said finally. I think I let fear make me cruel. Fear of losing you, fear of not being able to take care of you properly, fear of, I don't know, getting old myself someday. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I heard honesty in my son's voice. Not complete honesty, maybe, but a beginning. Fear makes people do terrible things, I said quietly. But so does greed, Daniel. And I need to know which one it was. Both, he whispered. God help me, Mom, it was both. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. Could. His voice cracked slightly. Could I come see you? Not to talk about money or wills or any of that. Just to see you. This was the moment Richard had been preparing me for. Not the will reading, not the money, but this, the choice between justice and mercy, between punishment and forgiveness. Yes, I said. You can come see me. When? Sunday, 2:00. And Daniel? Yes. Come alone. What we need to say to each other, we need to say as mother and son. Not as lawyers or clients or people fighting over money. Okay, he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. Thank you, Mom. After I hung up, I sat in my beautiful apartment and wondered if I was making the right choice. Richard had left me the power to destroy Daniel's life completely. The question was, what would love do with that power? Sunday was coming. And with it, the conversation that would determine whether our family could be saved, or if some wounds really are too deep to heal. What would you do? Would you forgive a child who threw you away? Would you give them a second chance, or let them live with the consequences of their choices? Because what happened next surprised everyone, including me. Sunday came with the kind of crisp October sunshine that Richard used to love. I spent the morning in my garden patio, tending to the small herb garden the staff had helped me plant, trying not to watch the clock. At 1:45, I moved to my living room and positioned myself in the chair that faced the door. Not the comfortable recliner where I usually read, but the straight-back chair that made me feel like the woman I used to be, before grief, before abandonment, before I let other people define my worth. Daniel knocked at exactly 2 o'clock. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. Gone was the expensive suit, the confident posture, the lawyer's mask of control. He stood in my doorway wearing jeans and a simple sweater, clothes I hadn't seen him wear since he was in college. His face looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, like he'd aged years in the 3 weeks since the will reading. "Hi, Mom," he said, and his voice carried none of the entitlement that had become his signature tone. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let him enter. He looked around my new apartment with genuine surprise. The hardwood floors, the kitchen, the French doors opening onto the patio. This wasn't the sterile nursing home room he'd left me in. "This is beautiful," he said. "It's what I could afford once I had access to my own money," I replied, not unkindly but not gently either. We sat across from each other, mother and son, separated by a coffee table and 6 months of pain. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I don't know how to start," he said finally. "Try the truth," I suggested. "All of it this time." Daniel took a shaky breath. "I was scared, Mom. When Dad died, I was terrified. Not just of losing him, but of what that meant for me. For my future. I kept thinking about getting old, about maybe ending up dependent on Sarah and Emma someday. And I looked at you grieving and lost, and instead of seeing someone who needed love, I saw a preview of what I might become. So when Elaine suggested the nursing home, it felt like solving 2 problems at once. You'd be taken care of, and I wouldn't have to face what losing Dad really meant." There it was. Not malice exactly, but something worse, cowardice dressed up as practicality. "And the money?" I asked. Daniel's face flushed red. I assumed Dad had left everything to both of us. When the lawyer said there wasn't much left after expenses, I believed it because I wanted to believe it. It made everything easier to justify. But if I'm being completely honest, Mom, even if I had known about the real estate, I probably would have done the same thing. Because I was thinking about my family, my future, my needs. I wasn't thinking about you as a person anymore. You'd become a problem to be managed. The honesty was brutal, but it was honest. And after months of lies and justifications, brutal honesty felt like a gift. "The girls ask about you," he said quietly. "Sarah wanted to visit you months ago, but Elaine said it would be too upsetting. Now they're asking why everyone at school is talking about us like we're terrible people." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That I made a mistake that hurt someone I love, and now I have to figure out how to live with that." For the first time since he'd walked in, Daniel looked like the son I remembered. Not the successful lawyer or the social climber, but the boy who used to apologize for breaking things by accident. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" I asked. "I want..." He paused, struggling with words. "I want to know if there's any way back from this. Any way to earn your forgiveness, your trust, your love again." And there it was. The question that had been keeping me awake in my beautiful new apartment. Not whether Daniel deserved forgiveness, but whether I could live with giving it or withholding it. "Let me think about it," I said finally. Daniel nodded, tears in his eyes. "That's more than I deserve." As he prepared to leave, I made one decision. "Daniel, bring the girls next time. They shouldn't be punished for your mistakes." "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Mom." After he left, I sat in my chair and wondered what Richard would want me to do. What love would do. What justice demanded. Because forgiveness wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about what kind of person I wanted to be with the power I'd been given. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my apartment, made tea I didn't drink, and finally ended up sitting on my patio under the stars, having another conversation with my dead husband. "What do you want me to do, Richard?" I asked the darkness. "You gave me this power, but you didn't give me the wisdom to use it." In my mind, I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. But the problem was, I could hear him arguing both sides. "He's our son, Maggie. People make mistakes when they're scared. Look at him now, really look. That's not the same man who called you useless. But some mistakes have consequences that can't be undone. Some words can't be taken back. What happens to the next elderly parent if there's no price for what he did?" That was what kept me awake. This wasn't just about Daniel and me anymore. Somehow, our story had become bigger than us, a cautionary tale about how families treat their elderly, about what happens when love comes with conditions. I knew people were watching. Evelyn had told me that families throughout Greenhill were having difficult conversations about their own situations. Adult children were visiting more frequently, asking more questions, treating their parents with more respect. "Your story is changing things," she'd said over dinner the night before. "You've become a symbol, honey. The question is, what kind of symbol do you want to be?" But symbols don't lie awake at night missing their children. Symbols don't remember teaching their sons to tie their shoes, or cheering at little league games, or sitting up all night when they had the flu. I wasn't a symbol. I was a mother. A mother with a broken heart and the power to break her son's life in return. The cruelest part was that I still loved him. Not the man who had abandoned me, but the boy he used to be. The child who had made me a mother. The reason Richard and I had bought that house, made those plans, built that life. How do you hold someone accountable without destroying them? How do you teach a lesson without becoming cruel yourself? How do you forgive without enabling? As the sun began to rise over my patio, I realized that Richard hadn't left me his fortune to make me wealthy. He'd left it to make me choose. To force me to decide what kind of love I believed in. And by morning, I knew what I had to do. It wouldn't make everyone happy. It wouldn't solve everything. But it would be true to the woman Richard had loved for 50 years. The woman who had never stopped believing that people could change, even when they'd broken her heart. Especially then. 6 months after the will reading, I'm sitting in the same patio where I made my decision about Daniel, watching my granddaughters help me plant tomatoes in my expanded garden. Sarah, now 17, has been visiting me every other weekend. Emma, 15, calls me every Tuesday after school to tell me about her drama club rehearsals. They're good girls who were caught up in their parents' mistakes, and they've embraced the chance to know their grandmother again. Daniel visits too, though our relationship is different now. Quieter. More honest. He's learning to apologize without expecting immediate forgiveness, to give without keeping score, to love without conditions. What did I decide that morning on my patio? I chose something harder than revenge and more complex than simple forgiveness. I kept the inheritance. All of it. Daniel would get nothing from Richard's estate, just as the will specified. But I also established a trust fund for Sarah and Emma's education, and I helped Daniel's family when they truly need it, on my terms with my conditions. Most importantly, I made it clear that my love was not for sale, but neither was my dignity. Daniel could earn back my trust through consistent, respectful behavior over time. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but by treating me like the person Richard had always seen me as. And you know what I've learned? I was never useless. Not when I was 20 and raising a baby. Not when I was 40 and supporting Richard through his father's death. Not when I was 70 and grieving the loss of my soulmate. Richard's will didn't make me valuable. It revealed the value that had always been there. The will didn't give me power. It gave me permission to use the power I'd forgotten I had. I've learned that dignity isn't something other people give you, it's something you refuse to let them take away. That love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's enabling. And that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the consequences of their own actions. The story of our family has spread far beyond the country club gossip circuit. I get letters from elderly people who found their voice again, from adult children who've realized they need to examine how they treat their aging parents, from families trying to heal from similar wounds. Because what happened to us happens everywhere, every day. Children who see their parents as burdens. Parents who mistake enabling for love. Families that fall apart under the weight of unspoken resentments and unchallenged cruelties. But Richard's final gift wasn't the money. It was the reminder that I mattered. That my 50 years of love and sacrifice and daily kindness had value. That the woman who had raised his son, supported his dreams, and loved him through everything deserved better than to be warehoused and forgotten. Our story isn't over. Daniel and I are still learning how to be mother and son again. The trust between us is rebuilding slowly, carefully, like the roses in my garden that Richard taught me to tend. But here's what I want you to remember. If someone calls you useless, they're telling you about themselves, not about you. If someone treats you as disposable, they're revealing their own poverty of spirit, not your lack of worth. You are not useless. You have never been useless. And if someone in your life needs to be reminded of that truth, don't be afraid to remind them. Because love that demands respect isn't selfish. It's necessary. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept being unloved. If this story touched your heart, if you recognize yourself or your family in Margaret's journey, subscribe and share it. Because every family needs to hear this truth. Our elderly aren't burdens to be managed, they're treasures to be honored. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between forgiveness and justice? How did you find the balance between love and boundaries? Your story might help someone else find their way through the darkness. Because that's what Richard's love taught me, even from beyond the grave, one person who truly sees your worth can remind you of who you really are. And who you really are. That's never useless. That's irreplaceable.